This is episode 13 of the Creator God Theory of the Atonement. I've titled it Creator God Greater Than His Creations, with the subtitle, No Need for Any Divine Calculus of Sins. Part 1. As we begin this episode, I want to return to a central problem we've raised before: why the atonement has never quite fit together within traditional Christian or even Latter-day Saint thought. The reason is simple. For centuries, believers have been trying to solve the how of the atonement without the right puzzle pieces. When you look at its two most essential features, its vicarious nature and its infinite nature, they simply don't fit together when the wrong pieces are on the table. It becomes like trying to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle with missing pieces, or worse, with pieces that don't even belong. I bring this up because, in the next 3 episodes, we are going to address 3 major misunderstandings that arise when missing or incorrect pieces are used to explain the atonement. These misunderstandings may appear unrelated, but they all stem from one central foundational error. We fail to acknowledge Jesus Christ as the full Creator God within the corporate Godhead. And without that Creator God identity, the missing central piece of the entire puzzle, the atonement simply cannot hold together. Without it, the vicarious nature of the atonement appears unjust. Without it, the infinite nature of the atonement becomes incoherent. Without it, every attempt to explain the atonement breaks apart because its central piece is missing. The point is this: once Christ is viewed merely as a representative or agent of the Father, even as the Son of God with full divine investiture, rather than as the actual Creator God Himself, the vicarious and infinite natures of the atonement collapse under their own weight. Once that foundational truth is lost, 3 predictable misunderstandings arise. They are not random mistakes. They are the natural and unavoidable consequences of trying to explain the vicarious and infinite nature of the atonement without the one central piece that makes the entire picture fit. Let me briefly introduce all 3 misunderstandings, because each one becomes the focus of the next 3 episodes. Misunderstanding number 1, the divine calculus error. This misunderstanding arises when we fail to recognize that the Creator is always infinitely greater than His creations. Misunderstanding number 2, the divine representative error. This misunderstanding arises when we reduce Christ to a creature, a representative, agent, or even a son with full divine investiture, instead of recognizing Him as the Creator God. Misunderstanding number 3, the divine experiential error. This misunderstanding arises when we assume Christ has personally experienced and internalized every creaturely lived experience and trial, every pain, sorrow, sin, and suffering as part of His atoning sacrifice. All 3 misunderstandings, the divine calculus error, the divine representative error, and the divine experiential error, arise from the same central error: failing to see Christ as the Creator God within a corporate Godhead. Once that missing piece is restored, the entire puzzle pertaining to the how of the atonement finally fits together justly, coherently, and scripturally. And with that Creator God framework in place, let's now turn to the first misunderstanding, the divine calculus error. Misunderstanding number 1 is what I call the divine calculus error, the belief that justice demands a divine ledger of sinners and sins. In this view, we tend to imagine divine justice as a kind of heavenly bookkeeping or accounting system. Every sin has a price. Every sinner carries a debt. And because the scriptures speak of Christ paying the debt, balancing the scales, and answering the demands of justice, we assume justice requires an exact, itemized calculation of every individual sin committed by every individual sinner. So it should not surprise us that many Latter-day Saints instinctively picture something like this: a divine ledger containing billions of people, trillions of sins, each sin with its own weight or penalty, from a few farthings or stripes for minor misdeeds to massive penalties for grievous transgressions. And in our minds, all these sins are added together into one grand sum: billions of people times trillions of sins times varying penalties, forming a single cosmic debt that must be totaled, measured, and above all, paid in full. Then we imagine Christ in Gethsemane and on Calvary, suffering the penalty, the full grand sum of that ledger, not a farthing less, not a farthing more, until every sinner ever born and every sin ever committed is precisely tallied and accounted for. This is how many Latter-day Saints intuitively imagine the atonement working. As though the demands of justice require a divine calculus, a ledger of sinners and sins, an exact itemized calculation, tallied and totaled, with the grand cosmic sum paid by Christ in Gethsemane and on Calvary. But this assumption has a history, and it is to that history we now turn. Now that we've described the divine calculus error, the next question naturally follows. Where did this misunderstanding come from? It didn't appear out of nowhere. In fact, three distinct historical and doctrinal sources have quietly shaped the way many Latter-day Saints imagine the atonement. The first source comes from traditional Christian theology with deep biblical and creedal roots. The very theories we examined in Episode 7, under the title Tumbleweed Theories of the Atonement. Among those theories, three in particular, laid the foundation for the divine calculus model. Penal substitution. Christ bears the exact penalty justice requires, the full punishment owed by every sinner. Satisfaction theory. Sin is treated as a debt owed to God's offended honor, a debt that must be satisfied in full to restore divine order. Governmental theory. Christ pays a representative penalty to uphold moral government, where justice is maintained through a punitive payment. These theories all frame the atonement within a legal accounting paradigm, debts, penalties, exact payments, and punitive balance sheets, and they supply the underlying architecture for the divine ledger model. Many Latter-day Saints eventually adopted and then overlaid with restoration language. But these traditional theories were only the first ingredient. A second influence also reinforced the divine calculus mindset, one drawn not from theology, but from Judgment Day imagery in Scripture itself. Let's turn now to this second source. Our second source behind the divine calculus misunderstanding comes from biblical and historical references, especially Judgment Day imagery. Scripture speaks of books being opened, of all being judged according to their works, and of every deed, good or evil, being brought into the light. These passages are familiar to Latter-day Saints and deeply embedded in our scriptural understanding, but it's crucial to notice what these passages are actually describing. They describe judgment, how we are evaluated for our choices and works, not the mechanics of the atonement itself. Over time, however, many have unconsciously conflated how we are redeemed with how we are judged, assuming that because our works are reviewed on Judgment Day, the atonement itself must operate by the same kind of recorded ledger, calculation, or accounting process. That conflation quietly reinforces the divine calculus error, the assumption that redemption must work the same way judgment works. Yet even these traditional atonement theories and this Judgment Day imagery taken together still don't fully explain how this misunderstanding took root within Latter-day Saint thought. For that, we need to look at the third and final source, how certain restoration scriptures, though entirely legitimate, have been misapplied in ways that unintentionally reinforce the divine calculus error. Let's turn to that now. Our third and final source behind the divine calculus misunderstanding comes from restoration scripture itself, particularly passages in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants that describe Christ's suffering in expansive and powerful terms. Consider three familiar examples. In Alma 7, we read that Christ would go forth, suffering pains and afflictions and temptations of every kind, taking upon him our infirmities, so that he might know how to succor his people. In 2 Nephi 9, we are told that Christ suffereth the pains of all men, yea, the pains of every living creature. And in Mosiah 3, the angel that appears to King Benjamin declares that Christ's anguish would be so great that blood cometh from every pore, because of the wickedness and abominations of his people. These are legitimate, inspired restoration passages, and Latter-day Saints rightly treasure them. The problem is not the scriptures themselves, it is how they are often interpreted. When read through a Judgment Day and penal substitution lens, these passages are commonly taken to mean that Christ must have individually accumulated and suffered the full totality of every sin, pain, temptation, sorrow, and defect of every sinner, past, present, and future, as though drawn from a cosmic ledger and calculated by a divine calculus. That interpretive move quietly reinforces the divine calculus error. It turns these passages into proof texts for a model in which every sin and every suffering must be added up, weighed, and endured in exact proportion. But that assumption is not required by the text, and once Christ is understood as the Creator God, it collapses. These passages describe the scope and depth of Christ's redemptive suffering. They do not describe an itemized accounting process, nor do they require that Christ literally replicate every lived experience of every individual sinner. They testify of who Christ is and what his suffering accomplishes, not of a divine spreadsheet. In short, these scriptures are inspired, but when misapplied through a legal accounting lens, they unintentionally support the very misunderstanding we are examining. And now, with all three sources on the table, traditional Christian legal theories, Judgment Day ledger imagery, and misapplied restoration scripture, we can finally see why the divine calculus error feels so compelling. But we can also see why it ultimately fails, because it rests on a false assumption that justice must be satisfied by calculating sins, rather than by the Creator taking responsibility for his creation. So now we turn to the heart of the solution within the Creator God theory, and to why once Christ is understood as the Creator God, there is no need for a divine calculus of sins at all. Before we explain why there is no need for a divine calculus of sins, let me lay out how we are going to proceed. We're going to move through three brief phases, each building upon the other. These three phases are: Phase 1, recognition, what we already assume. Phase 2, examination, can this model hold under scrutiny? Phase 3, reframing, how the Creator God theory changes everything. When we are done with all three phases, the idea of a divine calculus of sins associated with the atonement won't be needed, and it will quietly fade away. Before we examine whether the atonement works the way we often assume it does, we need to begin by simply naming that assumption. Most of us carry an intuitive picture of how justice applies to the atonement, shaped by tradition, scripture, imagery, and years of teaching, even if we've never consciously put it into words. In that picture, the one many of us already assume, justice functions like a divine ledger. Every sin carries a moral weight. Every action is assigned a value. Those values accumulate into a total. Justice, in this model, requires that the total be paid exactly. The atonement is then understood as Christ stepping in to suffer the precise sum of that moral debt, whether imagined as payment in farthings or penalty in stripes, the traditional scriptural language for financial and physical punishment. Not a farthing less, not a farthing more, not a stripe too many, not a stripe too few. To make that intuitive picture visible, consider this illustrative divine ledger, keeping in mind that the specific values are symbolic only, and that the underlying assumption is the point. Imagine entries like these: an unkind word, 1 farthing; shoplifting, 5 farthings; petting, 5 farthings; pornography, 20 stripes; abuse, 200 stripes; adultery, 500 stripes; grand larceny, 1,000 stripes; murder, 10,000 stripes. Again, the numbers themselves don't matter. What matters is the picture they create. Justice imagined as a ledger, where every act carries a weight, and every weight contributes to a total. Most of us have never written it down like this, but when we see it made explicit, there's a moment of recognition. We think, yes, that's basically how I've always pictured it. That recognition completes phase 1. Now we move to phase 2, examination. In this phase, the question is simple. Can the divine calculus model, the idea of a divine ledger of sinners and sins, actually hold under scrutiny? To answer that, we'll apply 2 tests to see whether its assumptions can stand up to how reality actually works. First, we'll examine the model using a common sense test, drawing on our everyday moral understanding of how justice and accountability function in the real world. Then, we'll examine the same model against our reality-based checklist for theories of the atonement, the framework we've already developed to test whether an atonement theory coheres with the principles of justice, causality, identity, and moral agency. If the divine calculus model can pass both tests, it deserves to be retained. If it cannot, it will fail, not by preference, but by the judgment of common sense and the constraints imposed by reality itself. We turn now to the first test, a common sense examination of this model. Let us begin this examination with a simple common sense test of credibility. By common sense, we mean the shared moral understanding we gain from everyday experience of how justice and accountability actually work in the real world. In other words, even before we test this model against our reality-based checklists, consider what the divine calculus assumes in ordinary common sense terms. It assumes that divine justice can be achieved and satisfied by calculating moral debt across billions of sinners, trillions of sins, infinite moral distinctions, infinite moral weightings, infinite contextual moral factors. In other words, it assumes a calculus of billions of sinners, multiplied by trillions of sins, multiplied again by infinite moral distinctions, weightings, and contextual factors. It also means that such a calculus must include at minimum every motive, every circumstance, every degree of knowledge, every extenuating circumstance, every unintended consequence. All of it must be accounted for and calculated into a single total sum. Why the divine calculus model fails this common sense examination. It fails because it is unreasonable to believe that divine justice is achieved by a limitless calculus of billions of sinners, times trillions of sins, times infinite moral distinctions, a claim common sense rejects. It fails because it is unreasonable to believe that such a calculus could ever account for every motive, every circumstance, every degree of knowledge, every extenuating circumstance, and every unintended consequence, a demand common sense rejects. A model that fails at the common sense level by proving unreasonable and unworkable in the real world cannot stand as a credible theory of the atonement. And this common sense verdict is not merely intuitive. It is grounded in reality itself, as we will see in Part 2 when we examine this divine calculus model against our reality-based checklist, and then reframe the how of the atonement entirely through the Creator God framework, where the Creator God is greater than His creations.